The 1960s were a golden age for music. Most people remember big names like the Beatles, the Rolling Stones, and the Beach Boys. But many other bands also had huge hits, played on every radio station, and packed concert halls, until they suddenly disappeared. Like stories like this? Hit subscribe and don't miss the next one. Let's take a look at some great bands from the 60s that once seemed unstoppable, but ended up as forgotten names in music history. The Zombies had a sound that was ahead of its time. With songs like Time of the Season and She's Not There, they blended smooth vocals, jazz-influenced chords, and a dreamy vibe that set them apart from many other 60s bands. Their 1968 album Odyssey and Oracle, recorded at Abbey Road, was filled with lush psychedelic arrangements and is now considered a classic. Back then, though, it didn't get the attention it deserved. Sadly, by the time their music started gaining real recognition, the band had already broken up. The Zombies were one of those rare groups that created something truly special, just a little too early for the world to notice. With their matching Revolutionary War outfits and high-energy performances, Paul Revere and the Raiders were impossible to miss in the mid-1960s. Their hit Kicks was not only catchy, but also one of the first mainstream anti-drug songs, a bold move at the time. They were regulars on Dick Clark's shows like Where the Action Is, and had a clean-cut image that appealed to a young audience. But as the decade wore on and psychedelic rock and edgier sounds took over, their style started to feel outdated. Despite their early success, the band couldn't keep up with the fast-changing music scene, and their fame faded almost as quickly as it had arrived. The Hollies were one of the key bands in the British invasion, with hits like Bus Stop and the emotional ballad He Ain't Heavy, He's My Brother. Their tight harmonies and polished pop rock sound made them a regular presence on the charts. They had all the ingredients for lasting fame, but somehow they never reached the legendary status of groups like the Beatles or the Rolling Stones. Even with future stars like Graham Nash, who would later join Crosby, Stills, and Nash, the Hollies remained just under the top tier. They continued making hits into the 70s, like The Air That I Breathe, and were eventually inducted into the Rock and Roll Hall of Fame in 2010. Still, their name is often forgotten in the shadow of their more famous peers. The Lovin Spoonful brought a light, feel-good sound to the 60s with songs like Do You Believe in Magic and Summer in the City. Their music captured the carefree vibe of the decade's early years, sunny, upbeat, and full of charm. But behind the scenes, the band dealt with legal troubles, internal tension, and eventually the departure of frontman John Sebastian in 1968. As rock music shifted toward darker, heavier themes, their playful style started to feel out of place. They had a strong start, but the changing times and their own issues meant their moment in the spotlight didn't last. The Turtles shot to fame in 1967 with Happy Together, a bright, joyful track that became an instant classic. Their sunny pop sound captured the spirit of the time and made them radio regulars. But behind the scenes, the band struggled with creative disagreements and issues with their record label. As music tastes changed, their light style fell out of favor. By the early 70s, the Turtles had faded fast, leaving behind just a few hits and a lot of unrealized potential. Still, members Mark Volman and Howard Kalin later reinvented themselves as Flo and Eddie, joining Frank Zappa's band and building a cult following of their own. The Grassroots delivered hit after hit in the late 60s, with songs like Midnight Confessions and Let's Live for Today. Their mix of rock and pop made them a radio staple. Originally a studio creation guided by Dunhill Records and producers P.F. Sloan and Steve Barry, the band evolved into a real touring act with strong chart success. But as the music scene turned heavier and more experimental, their sound started to feel too safe. They couldn't evolve fast enough to stay relevant. Despite the hits, the Grassroots slowly faded from view, overshadowed by the harder-edged rock bands of the new era. The Beau Brummels were ahead of the curve. With their 1965 hit, Laugh, Laugh, they mixed folk and rock before bands like the Byrds made it mainstream. Their sound was fresh, moody, and distinctly American. Despite often being mistaken for a British group, they had talent, timing, and a unique sound, even working early on with future funk icon Sly Stone as a producer. But the British invasion quickly stole the spotlight. The competition was fierce, and they got lost in the shuffle. Though influential, they never got the recognition they deserved and quietly slipped into obscurity. The association scored big with smooth romantic hits like Cherish and Windy. Their soft harmonies and polished production made them stand out in the mid-60s. They were even among the first bands to perform at the historic Monterey Pop Festival in 1967. But as rock music grew louder and rougher, their clean sound fell out of style. What once felt fresh started to seem old-fashioned. They had the talent, but the era moved on without them. The Tremeloes made waves with upbeat tracks like Here Comes My Baby and Silence is Golden. Their cheerful, catchy style fit perfectly in the early 60s pop scene. But as music turned darker and more serious, their bubblegum sound didn't keep up. They struggled to adapt and faded quickly from the charts, fun while it lasted, but easily forgotten. The Yardbirds weren't just a band, they were a launchpad for three of rock's greatest guitarists, Eric Clapton, Jeff Beck, and Jimmy Page. With songs like For Your Love and Heart Full of Soul, they pushed musical boundaries and helped shape psychedelic and hard rock. Eventually, the band evolved into something new. Led Zeppelin was essentially born from the Yardbirds' final lineup. The Yardbirds were legendary, but the world mostly remembers the names that came after. The 1960s were full of musical magic, but not every band that found success got to keep it. Some were ahead of their time, others couldn't keep up with fast-changing trends. A few simply got overshadowed by bigger names, as still their songs remain, on old records, nostalgic playlists, or buried in the memories of a generation. These bands may not be household names anymore, but they helped shape the sound of a legendary era. Sometimes, it's worth hitting rewind to hear the ones we forgot. Enjoyed this trip down memory lane? Subscribe for more stories from music's forgotten corners, and rediscover the sounds time almost erased.